Hi everyone, my name is Alyssa Sherrier and I'm your presenter. So today we'll be discussing dietary standards and how to choose foods. The first thing I want to discuss is the concept of malnutrition and just what is it? So there are two types of malnutrition occurring throughout the world today. The first is undernutrition, and this is defined as a deficiency of energy or nutrients. According to the UNFAO, undernutrition currently affects around 680 million people worldwide. The second is overnutrition, and this is an excessive consumption of energy in the form of calories that lead a person to be overweight or obese. According to the WHO, there are currently 2.2 billion adults throughout the world that are overweight, with 650 million of these people being obese. So actually, you can see overnutrition is an increasingly worsening problem. Both of these together have led to what we call the double burden of malnutrition. So, the thing that's interesting about all of this is that, in great part, the scientific process has helped us to know what we need to do to eliminate malnutrition. Um, we have identified what are considered essential nutrients for a person's diet. We know where to find these essential nutrients in foods. Through food preservation practices like we just discussed last week, we have technology that has enabled us to process healthy foods for transport all around the world. We have a pretty good understanding of the appropriate caloric intake for an individual based on their age and their activity level, etc. And we have determined what types of eating patterns are consistent with good health. However, the hard part is that making this happen is actually very complicated because there's other mitigating factors that keep these things from being implemented, including our own decisions. So I'm going to go over a historical example of how through the scientific process we've gained understanding about one aspect of human nutrition. We're going to talk about finding a cure for rickets. So what is rickets? It's a childhood disorder that involves softening and weakening of the bones. And you can see these children here on the right have bowed legs that are representative of the effects of this bone softening. Rickets was a serious problem in Western Europe and the US in the early 1900s. But starting at the turn of the century, we started to have kind of increases in what to do to help this problem. So in 1908, in Glasgow, Scotland, the medical school recommended fresh air and exercise as a cure and preventative measure for rickets. In 1919, the Vienna Children's Hospital was able to cure rickets using UV light and cod liver oil. And finally, in 1931, the active agent from these treatments was crystallized. It was vitamin D, which makes sense because our bodies synthesize vitamin D through UV exposure, like from the sunshine. So spending time outdoors, being exposed to UV light, and eating cod liver oil, which has a high concentration of vitamin D, would provide enough vitamin D as a cure. So vitamin D is now considered an essential vitamin that we take, and we can even be taken in a capsule form daily. So, like I said, we've made a lot of discoveries, but we still struggle with that double burden of malnutrition. In fact, obesity is a growing problem worldwide. But why? Well, one thing we've already discussed is that as a country's income is increasing, so does meat consumption. What we have also found is that as the country's income increases, so does our consumption of what we call empty calories, which are defined as refined fats, sugars, alcohols, and oil. And neither, meaning basically we're getting a lot more food, it's just not really nutritious. And we'll get into that next time. And neither of these patterns are sustainable for long-term health or the environment, as we'll discuss later. Actually, as we reduce undernutrition, which we are working at, we tend to select for overnutrition, which can be the issue. So let's take a look at the typical foods people are eating throughout the world based on country. So as I flip through the slides, I want you to pause your video to analyze what different countries are eating and pay attention to some trends you observe. So our first country is the United States. This would be considered a developed country. So lots of food. These are all about a week's worth of food. So a lot of food, but is it all healthy? That's what I want you to ask yourselves. And what do you see? Do you see extra fats and things like that in there? Next, we have Canada, which is also a developed country. This is also a week's worth of food for this family. And Turkey, which is considered somewhere between a transitioning and developed country. This is a week's worth of food for this family. This is Ecuador. They are considered a developing country. Bhutan, developing. Also, this is the food for this entire family for a week. And then we have Chad, which is a developing country, and you can see this is the food that this family would purchase for their entire week. So here is my observation. As a country becomes more wealthy or developed, we eat less healthy. And where there is less wealth, the food choices are often more healthy, but the availability and variety is poor. Additionally, as we'll now discuss, as we become more wealthy, our eating style is proposed to be less environmentally friendly. However, in areas of lower health, patterns may be more environmentally friendly, but waste is decreased because they have lack of processing, as we discussed last time. So what of these is the most sustainable eating style, or how should we eat for the future, I guess? So let's first discuss the environmental burden of our eating styles. And first, before we even do that, I'm just going to go over some future eating styles for you to consider. The first is to stay the course, meaning wealthy countries will not change their style, and as other countries have access to more food and protein options, they will also adopt the current developed world eating style, which is a lot of meat, saturated fats and sugars, and a reduction in vegetables and fruits. The second is to follow a mostly vegetarian diet. This would have an exception of maybe eating eggs and meat one time per month. The third is to follow a pescatarian diet. This is similar to a vegetarian diet, but also includes fish. And finally, the last eating style would be to adopt what we call a Mediterranean eating style, and you read about this this week. This is rich in fruits, veggies, whole grains, seafood, and has a moderate amount of meat. Okay, so to determine the environmental sustainability of one of these eating styles, we need to consider two factors. The first one is how much greenhouse gas emissions will be produced, and then the second is how much cropland will be needed to sustain this particular style. So if we stay on the course of our current eating trend, we will expect to see a substantial increase in both greenhouse gas emissions and cropland use, which we don't necessarily have room, that wiggle room. If we adopt a fully vegetarian style, we will still have an increase, but it will be reduced by 1/3 from the stay the course. And we will still have an increase in cropland use, but it will be reduced by 2/3. If we adopt a pescatarian eating style, we'll see no increase in either greenhouse gas emissions or cropland use. And finally, if we adopt a Mediterranean style of eating, it's predicted there will be both reduced greenhouse gas emissions and reduced need for cropland. So this is something to consider of these. This suggests that the Mediterranean is going to be the most sustainable of the diets for the future. But which of these diets is the most sustainable for our health? So I want you to pause the video and try to understand what this figure is telling you for yourself. So first, it's important to recognize that this figure is evaluating a reduction in relative risk for type 2 diabetes, cancer, coronary mortality, and then all-cause mortality. So a higher value here means a lower risk. And that probably seems a little bit backwards, but I wanted to point that out. So if we look at all-cause mortality here on the right, if adopted, the Mediterranean diet can reduce all-cause mortality by 20% by 2050. So in both cases, whether we're looking at environmental sustainability or for our health, it seems that the Mediterranean diet is the most logical one to choose. Additionally, the dietary guidelines are from the US and they have been established based on science and they support the Mediterranean diet as well. The following is a summation of eating style suggestions. So first, eat a variety of vegetables, include whole fruits, at least half of grain. Half of your grain intake should be whole grains. You need to include nuts, seeds, and legumes in your variety of protein intake and reduce animal flesh. Limit your saturated fats and trans fats. Control added sugar and sodium intake, and then balance calories to maintain a healthy weight. And finally, although I hope you don't do this, but if alcohol is consumed, do so in moderation. Okay, so these guidelines are based on scientific discovery over the last century, and I want to demonstrate how sometimes both scientific discovery and revelation both lead us to the same truth. In the Doctrine and Covenants section 89, which is the word of wisdom, the Lord states in verses 10, 12, and 16, and again, verily I say unto you, all wholesome herbs, so some veggies there, God hath ordained for the constitution, nature, and use of man. Yea, flesh also of beasts and of the fowls of the air, I the Lord have ordained for the use of man with thanksgiving. Nevertheless, they are to be used sparingly. And all grain is good for the food of man, as also the fruit of the vine. That which yieldeth fruit, so that's your grains and fruits, that which yieldeth fruit, whether in the ground or above the ground. Okay, so these things sort of line up also with the diet we just talked about, the dietary guidelines and the Mediterranean diet. Finally, I just want to end with the promise that the Lord leaves us at the end of the Word of Wisdom. In verses 18 through 21, it states, "And all saints who remember to keep and do these sayings, walking in obedience to the commandment, shall receive health in their navel and marrow to their bones, and shall find wisdom and great treasures of knowledge, even hidden treasures, and shall run and not be weary, and shall walk and not faint. And I, the Lord, give unto them a promise, that the destroying angel shall pass by them, as the children of Israel, and not slay them again." And I love that, because obeying the word of wisdom, it doesn't actually free us from having to deal with those diseases or other issues that are part of our mortal experience, but it can severely reduce our risks of getting some of them. And what a promise, right? To find wisdom and great treasures of knowledge, and more importantly, by following the word of wisdom, we protect our spirit by taking care of our bodies. So now it's up to you to decide what you need to do to better take care of your body.